Good afternoon and welcome to a very warm and sunny Alloa in the central Scotland, where the summer heat wave seems to have arrived for the next, probably next 2 hours until I'm free to go back outside, and then it'll disappear again. My name is Hugh Dan McLennan. We've probably met at some point over the last day or so, and this is our penultimate session now, making it work at a local level, which is a subject probably very close to everyone's hearts, and is building probably on a lot that we might have heard if you were with us in the memory section earlier this morning. Some of the similar themes that we heard then will no doubt be appearing here. I've got three guests, three panelists. We're probably quite familiar with most of them now. I think we've all met each other, so I'm going to spare the introductions. As ever, we'll be taking questions through the chat facility. If you want to contribute anyway to the debate that we're having, we can do that, and we're aiming to finish at 3 o'clock to give us a short break before we go into the closing session. So without any more ado, we'll start in Northern Ireland. Keith Beatty, local historian, a wonderfully understated description of his abilities and area of work, and he's going to tell us about Come on Antrim, something I've heard myself very often in hurling circles and other places, but he's celebrating Marathon Mac's Centenary. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks very much. Okay, folks. Basically, this is a presentation about Marathon Mac. Probably most of you probably haven't heard of him. He's Canada Kane Macarthur. He was an Olympian from Ireland, and he won the gold medal in the marathon in Stockholm in 1912 while competing for his adopted home of South Africa. He was born in 1881 in the village of Dervick, a few miles from the busy market town of Ballymoney in North Antrim. Around 1901, aged 20 years old, Macarthur emigrated to South Africa. Shortly after arriving in his new home, he began to compete in distance running. At this time, there were relatively few long-distance races. In fact, the first marathon in South Africa did not take place until 1907, and Macarthur didn't run his first marathon until April 1908 in Johannesburg, and he won the race. Now, many would say that he was probably an unlikely marathon runner. He was 6'2" tall and over 12 stone, but he had a natural athletic ability. To give an example of this, it's reported that at a marathon in Durban, he finished, showered, dressed, and was seen casually walking from the stadium smoking his pipe, just as the second place competitor struggled across the finish line. So when he stepped up to the line that day on the 14th of July 1912 in Stockholm, he'd never been beaten in the marathon. However, he hadn't run a competitive marathon for 20 months, and he'd actually only ever competed in 5 other marathons. So the temperature on the day of the races was sweltering, and this suited Macarthur and his fellow South African Christian Gitson. By the closing stages of the race, the two South Africans were out in front. And we're told that Macarthur and Gitson had a gentleman's agreement. If one stopped for a rest, they would both stop together. A few miles from the finish, Gitson halted briefly for a drink. He gulped down the water, and then, unfortunately, he developed a stitch. And Macarthur ran on alone. By the time he reached the stadium, Macarthur had a commanding lead, but he was close to exhaustion. Suddenly, from the crowd, a well-wisher ran forward and placed a garland around Macarthur's neck, and you can see it in the picture on the screen. Now, this was enough to finish him, and within sight of the line, he staggered and fell to his knees. And then, according to the legend, Macarthur heard a voice over the roar of the crowd shouting his name in an Irish accent, saying, "Macarthur, come on, Antrim, come on, ye boy, ye." And this gave him the last burst of energy it said that he needed to get onto his feet and over the line and win the gold. And Gitson finished a minute behind him. So South Africa took the gold and the silver. So Macarthur's running career finished a year later when he was injured in a freak cycling accident, hitching a ride by holding onto the back of a passing cart. Between 1908 and 1912, he had run only 6 marathons. Stockholm was his last, and he remained unbeaten. So if we bring the story forward to 2012, the centenary of Macarthur's marathon victory, it fell quite fortuitously in the same year as the London Olympics. The Centenary provided an opportunity to celebrate a sporting achievement, but also to use the story of the Marathon Mac to provide entry-level activities and events which would encourage a wider audience to engage and get excited about London 2012. At that time, there were genuine concerns in Northern Ireland that while it was part of the UK, the Games would be too distant and have little resonance with local people. And with this in mind, a programme was developed in partnership with various agencies. As manager at Ballymoney Museum, I had started planning a few years in advance. I was aware that in his birthplace, the Derby Community Association wanted to do something special to commemorate the centenary, and I began to work with them and discuss ideas. In addition to local partnerships, international links were formed, and the councils in both Ballymoney and Potchefstroom, where Macarthur's hometown in South Africa, committed a respectable budget for a programme of events. The main focus for myself as manager at the museum was an exhibition. This was made possible thanks to Heritage Lottery funding. Potchefstroom Museum, where Macarthur's widow had deposited his medals and other material, generously agreed to loan the Macarthur collection to Ballymoney during the summer of 2012. And this loan was coordinated through an international museum courier. Macarthur's Olympic team blazer, the linen shirt number he wore during the race, and many of his medals, awards and trophies were shipped from Potchefstroom to Ballymoney. Unfortunately, this didn't include his gold Olympic medal, the whereabouts of which remains unknown. The museum exhibition was then enhanced by school workshops and community lectures. Pupils took part in sessions of activity-based learning, focusing on Macarthur's story, participation in sport, London 2012, and exploring what exactly makes a hero. They also joined in craft workshops, making over 100 Olympic torches, which were used later in a carnival parade through Dervick. A basic website acted as a hub for various digital resources and a contact point to keep the public aware of what was happening. To complement the museum activities, Lottery were very eager to see some high-profile public interaction. So this meant taking the Macarthur story into the community, and in the first instance, right into the centre of Ballymoney. On a quiet summer's evening in June 2012, I managed to get the roads briefly closed to reenact the events which took place when Macarthur made a triumphant return to the town following his Olympic glory. Straight after Stockholm in August 1912, Macarthur had come back to Ireland. On his arrival in Ballymoney railway station, he was greeted by a crowd, a guard of honour, formed by the Boys' Brigade. The townspeople then commandeered a carriage, unharnessed the horses, and a group of men pulled Macarthur in the carriage to the town hall for his civic reception. With the help of the present-day Boys' Brigade and the Springwell Running Club, we reenacted this historic occasion, and it succeeded in generating some very important community interest and involvement at an early stage. And we were also fortunate to get some valuable coverage on local television. In addition to the reenactment, I commissioned a new play based on Macarthur's story, and again, local involvement proved an essential aspect of this element of the commemoration. The play was performed in Ballymoney Town Hall 100 years to the day since Macarthur's achievement, and then a week later it was staged in Dervick Primary School, and following the performance, the actor playing Macarthur led several hundred people in a carnival parade through the village to light our own Olympic flame. The next morning, Dervick held its annual marathon. Each July since 1984, the Dervick Community Association had held a Macarthur marathon or a half marathon, and in recent years, the greater part of the organising have been undertaken by the Springwell Running Club. And the event is exclusively organised by volunteers, and it's open to everybody. On the day of the Centenary Marathon in Dervick, we were joined by another Olympic gold medalist, Dame Mary Peters, and we also had our friends from Potchefstroom, including the Mayor and senior councillors. So briefly to conclude, what were the most successful outcomes of the commemoration? Well, without question, it increased community cohesion and community pride. Feedback and evaluation of the commemoration came from a wide variety of people and demonstrated that we had indeed reached a diverse audience of all ages from North Antrim and beyond. In some ways, timing was always going to be a major obstacle for us. The centenary fell in July, a traditional holiday period. In several instances, this prevented potential partnerships with different agencies who told us they either stopped meeting over the summer or could not commit because their members were on holidays. But the timing also had a very positive impact in other ways. It meant that we were able to welcome the Olympic torch to the village on its circuit of the country, and the programme of events succeeded in making London 2012 much more tangible for everyone in the district and making them feel part of the whole Olympic experience. Also, the Macarthur events on London 2012 coincided with the annual 12th of July celebrations here in Northern Ireland, where the Protestant community commemorate the Battle of the Boyne. It's probably one of the biggest days of the year for the folks in Dervig, but in the past it's also been a period of tension in the province. However, thankfully, the Macarthur Festival helped to shift attention onto a different aspect of local history, something which people could be hugely proud of and share with everyone, even with people from another country and culture on the other side of the world. It also raised confidence within the community. The villagers saw what could be achieved when they worked alongside council and other agencies, and they learned from their experience. Dervig has since delivered a series of high-profile activities, and the running club continues to help with the community association organise an annual half marathon or marathon. The most essential ingredient for this success was working at grassroots and working with the community as much as for the community. Being part of such a broad programme of events and activities, it did put considerable pressure on myself and my colleague at the museum. It took us far outside our comfort zone, and on a few occasions we had very steep learning curves. But it gave the local residents, the ratepayers, the people who pay our wages, a series of opportunities to engage with our museum, whether as museum visitors, school pupils, theatre goers, actors, reenactors, sports fans, runners, or of course simply as a family wanting to get involved in their local community. So thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed that talk.
Thank you very much, Keith. That was fascinating. I have to say I knew nothing about the runner at all, so that was very revealing. And also, I think you've got an interesting case study there of how something local has a hugely global dimension, and then with all the various dynamics of the situation you have and the timing and so on in Northern Ireland, particular challenges you had to face there, and I can see the comfort zone thing would have been quite a challenge. But just a quick question: did you capture much of all these events in the aftermath? Did you film the play, for example?
Somewhere there's a film of the play. I've moved on from the museum since then. There's quite a good gallery of photographs, yeah, and feedback, that kind of thing. We didn't do as much as usual. We didn't do as much as we could at the time. We were preoccupied with other things, but it's still, people still talk about it, which is very gratifying.
Good, excellent, well done. Thank you very much for that. So let's move on then to Tim, who's nailed his colours very firmly to the mast with his strip and his background, which leaves nobody in any doubt as to where he's from or who he's representing. Well, he's actually representing the Heritage Society, to be specific, for Ipswich Town. And this is probably the most eagerly awaited session of the whole conference, because if you can have the answers to this one, Tim, we'd all be obliged. No funding. No problem. Explain.
Thank you. I'll just click the button and see if I can share my screen. Find the right version of the show. Go on to full screen, hopefully. Try one more time. There we are. We're there. I got the idea for this actually at the conference last year. And I'll try to explain. I'll read my first bit of script. The rest I'll simply wing in my usual way. I should explain the Ipswich Town Heritage Society basically is a partnership of myself and my wife Liz. We retired out of jobs in the city some years ago to do stuff we enjoy, which is this mostly. Liz is also a director of the football club. She's also their supporter liaison officer. So we're reasonably well connected, but essentially we're a cottage industry. We don't have a museum and we don't have huge resources behind us. So over the years, we've always tried to find ways of getting the heritage message, the ITFC history message across without the benefit of substantial funding. And my focus today is on the benefits of partnerships. What we have is passion and some subject matter expertise. And we want to enthuse others to use our heritage as part of their offering. I'll give a couple of examples of where that's worked in the past, but in a COVID world, it gets a little bit harder. What I hope is that in the end, I'll be able to demonstrate that lack of funding isn't a huge issue to us, provided you focus on helping partner organisations and maybe they have their own profile, experience, and maybe access to more funding than we have, help them to achieve their objectives and we can achieve ours. Here we go. So previously, and I've spoken at previous conferences on one or two of these things, we've worked on a number of major activities. I think the best to date was helping our local professional theatre to write and produce a dedicated musical based on our 40th anniversary of the FA Cup back in, well, the FA Cup within '78. This ran for 3 weeks to nearly 10,000 people and opened up the theatre to audiences that they'd never expected to get to, demographics which really tick their box when it comes to their future funding. But more than that, it was a huge amount of fun as well. Also on this slide, you can see a picture of the first, dare I say, professional level exhibition we've ever put on. We've moved away from laminated acetates that we mostly use, home printed, into proper interpretation boards, which actually aren't very expensive to pull together. And that was part of a tiny exhibition in a corner of the club shop in town last year. So again, something where the space cost us nothing. The units which house bits of memorabilia were found and just ever so slightly upgraded with a lock. So simple things which get the message across to many, many thousands of people. We of course work also with Sporting Memories, and also were part of a major photographic art project for the 78th anniversary with an organisation called Photo East. Their expertise, our passion and our contacts. And then we move into a COVID year, and we had great plans because 2021 is also the 40th anniversary of the club's winning the Uefa Cup. And in fact, if you can see the badge on my shirt, you can see it's a heritage badge on the town's shirt for this season. Fantastic example of how an organisation will take heritage and use it as part of their current day offering. We plan to have an exhibition in the town centre, special Sporting Memories socials around the county, socials to help fans meet their heroes, memorabilia days. We have a presence in the fan zone at the club every single match day, and we meet hundreds of people every single match day. Oh, but none of that can happen. Then we got lucky. As I said, we do some work with Sporting Memories. The guys who run it here are fantastic. And they put us in touch with Suffolk Archives, previously the Suffolk Records Office. And they got in touch with them and said, we've got a fantastic, fabulous new heritage centre, and we'd like to talk to you about some kind of display, maybe associated with this anniversary. As I say, we don't have our own museum, but we're very, very happy to borrow space free of charge in other people's. They have funding, of course, they have presence, and it's a fantastic facility they have. The idea was to curate a temporary exhibition there for maybe a couple of months around the anniversary next May. That fell away because all their deadlines have gone. They're actually late opening, there are other things they need to do, but they said, hey, don't worry, we're also getting a hold through our funding of a caravan. And we think we can do a touring exhibition to take your story, your 40th anniversary of Uefa Cup win, into the caravan and tour it around the county, maybe from March to May next year. But honestly, I really wish I'd thought of that idea. I think it's one of the best ideas I've ever come across, whether in a COVID world or not. We launched the whole thing on National Sporting Heritage Day, of course. Got good publicity for it locally. And I'd like to give a big shout out to our partners at Suffolk Archives, Bridget, Mandy and Emily. They are the epitome of professionalism and passion. They're a dream to work with, and boy, are we having to up our game just to even dream of matching them. But it's fantastic to be associated with people like that. There's the obligatory launch picture. If the memorabilia looks a little sparse, well, we didn't have access to the club at the time, so that's actually just taken from our own collection within our own house. There we are, just beginning to launch the project and moving into, well, what's it going to be? Look at those pictures, aren't they lovely? Taken by a friend of ours, Pat Edwards, who was actually at the UEFA Cup final second leg in Amsterdam with her friends in 1981. And we're pretty sure that the young lady on the bottom left of the lower picture is actually Liz, my wife, who was there despite it being the week of her final exams at university. She actually studied for her finals on the boat coming back. An example of the kind of stories that we'll be capturing. So a touring exhibition, it's almost COVID-proof in that it doesn't need large numbers of people to go into it at a time. In fact, ideally, just dribs and drabs, 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s, going around towns and villages, going around local sports clubs where also we intend with Suffolk Archives to collect their history and their stories as well. We'll be training volunteers, but it's not difficult to find volunteers who are passionate about this story and about their part in it as a fan. We'll be using memorabilia from the club and from individuals, interpretation boards, video footage. We've got great historic press coverage, both here and also from France and Germany, from friends we have over there. We will be involving players from the 81 team and trying to essentially create as big an experience as we can in perhaps as small a space as you've ever seen. To me, we'll be able to deliver everything we wanted to do in this year, but actually in a better way by taking the memorabilia, the memories, the stories out to the people. And we'll be sharing some images. This is an example of the kind of image we use. It's a chap and his dad. We think that was an open day a couple of years ago, a year or so ago, maybe. So what's interesting in that? What's interesting in that picture is the one that came nearly 40 years before. That one, isn't that cute? Dad and son. We love those kind of pictures. And any we can collect like that, of course, we're going to love to use and give everybody a smile and a reminisce. It's not just about the 40th anniversary where we use this as an opportunity to put across the tale that the club has a longer history. That actually is a very early team photo from about 1883. And there are a number of other images which, even if they're not anything to do with the 40th anniversary, I'm just passionate about old bus pics and celebrations, and we've got loads of these, and Suffolk Archives came up with this one and said, can you date it for us? We're pretty sure it's 1938. It's certainly late 30s when we were first a professional team and elected into the Football League. There'll be so much more material which we're going to come across, which we can then collect, collate, share with Suffolk Archives, to an extent digitize, increase our collection, but most importantly, share that word with everybody. And that to me is as good an example of partnership without it actually costing us anything at all at this stage. There's a further example of a partnership though that I also just wanted to raise in the last couple of minutes here, and something that's just happened over the last few weeks that moves us in a slightly different direction. Because we're aware partnerships are a two-way process. You have to bring something to the table to be able to take something from the table. And we benefit from our relationship with the football club itself. We're kind of a part of it, independently run. But equally, we feel that we owe them a lot because they provide us with enormous support, with premises and people and skills and so many things that we wouldn't be able to do by ourselves. We don't need their money. We need all those soft skills and capabilities. So how could we in any way contribute to ITFC in a way that creates some kind of virtuous circle of benefit? Or in Liz's words, if only we could support the club financially, promote our work despite the fact we can't see hundreds of people in the fan zone every week, and ideally still get very cold and wet while watching live football. Not so easy at the moment, but could we do it? And we came up with a solution, and the next image shows what it is. So you see the Uefa Cup badge there, 40 years, worn here on the shirt of the ITFC women's team, because they're very much a part of our history as well. A history that, to our shame, we haven't yet recorded, but don't worry, we're on that one. And on their shirt sleeve, the logo of the Ipswich Town Heritage Society. It's a personal sponsorship, but we've used the Heritage Society logo because it gets across the idea that we're very much part of the club and part of the history, as is the women's team. They themselves last year made their own little bit of history. They were the first side from the 4th tier to reach the last 16 of the FA Cup, and they promoted themselves with no suggestion from us as #historymakers, something I absolutely love. So we're personal sponsors of them this season. There's two of the players, Blue and Eloise, modelling the shirt. They're also part of the England age setup. In fact, this week we have 9 players out training with England St George's Park as part of the under-19s, 18s and 17s. A massive, massive part now of ITFC, something we're utterly proud to be a part of, and the heritage logo is there every single time they're out there on the field. And the fact that they're winning most of their games is getting them publicity that we couldn't conceivably ever buy for ourselves, and getting those pictures out to the widest of audiences. So it's a fantastic win-win for us, and we're delighted to be there, to be fair. And that effectively is our story of how we're able to partner with other organisations and benefit from it without it costing either anything or very, very little. Final slide here, just an example of how ITFC themselves support us. If you go onto their main website and search Heritage Society, our main activities are up there and promoted by them. That is what we do. We love it, and we're looking forward to doing even more, and thank you for the opportunity to share the story with you.
Thanks very much, Tim. That's fascinating and a very, again, another really illuminating case study of what can be done. And the word opportunity came through an awful lot, you know, and I'm going to touch on that. I think we'll spend some time on it in the closing session, because for all the difficulties we're all experiencing at the moment, it's clear over the 2 days that people are finding opportunities to reposition themselves, repurpose the groups, and address things in different ways. And we'll come back to that in the discussion. Come on, a little bit nearer to home now, back to Scotland, and our third speaker in the afternoon is Ingrid Shearer. She's a Heritage Engagement Officer with the Glasgow Building Preservation Trust, the West Boathouse project. And just intriguingly there, just before you start, a message come up there. I'm sure we could all produce pictures of a young child in a trophy. There's one here from Scotland, from Arlington Baths in Glasgow, who have got a similar one of a baby in a silver gala prize bowl. He's now 6 foot tall and in his late 20s. But I'm sure we could all embarrass somebody with similar trophies from various sports. So I don't know if you can help us in that way, but let's hear what you've got for the third contribution then, Ingrid.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. Okay, I'll just share my screen now. I hope you can all see that. Okay, so the West Boathouse is a Category B listed building. It was built in 1905 for the two clubs who are still tenants in there. That's Clydesdale and Clyde Amateur Rowing Clubs. When the building reopens, it will no longer be that kind of semi-detached setup, and the two clubs' traditional rivals will have to share their spaces and facilities. In addition to repairing and adapting the space, there will be major improvements to accessibility, upgraded facilities, and provision for flexible multi-use spaces that will be available to local groups and businesses for hire. The project also aims to change how the boathouse is used and who it's used by, and that's really where my role comes in as the Heritage Engagement Officer. The total project budget stands at around 2.7 million at the moment, most of which is going towards the capital works, actually onto the building itself. Principal funding has come from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, Historic Environment Scotland, the Robertson Trust, the Architectural Heritage Fund, the William Grant Foundation, and Glasgow City Council. Now, we've had lots of delays to the capital works, but we are hoping to get on site within the next few months, and fingers crossed we should reopen in the spring of 2022. My part of the project, the community engagement, has had a bit of a head start on the building works, and since we're roughly about the midpoint stage in the project, it seemed like a good opportunity to kind of reflect on that first year, respond to our evaluation, and also probably overhaul it quite dramatically in light of the impact of COVID. So this lovely photo shows the front of the building that faces onto the river. If you were feeling generous, you might describe it as shabby chic. And I'll talk over some of the issues with the fabric of the building as we go on. The landward facing elevation is actually quite austere, and it really comes to life when you see it from the water. It's a utilitarian building, but there are lots of really lovely little kind of architectural flourishes that, yeah, really quite charming building. It has an unusual timber frame superstructure and substructure built on these enormous timber piles that kind of pin it to the riverbank. Unfortunately, 28 of those 30 timber piles have mouldered away to something like a consistency of wet Weetabix. But thankfully, the refurbished building will have new foundations and a new roof, reinstated balconies, accessible lifts and changing facilities, and this multi-purpose community space. We're also putting in a pontoon to improve access to the river for rowers and other water users. At the heart of the project are two really quite simple messages. For anyone participating in activities, volunteering or visiting the building when it reopens, The message must be that this is a welcoming and an accessible space. It is a boathouse for everyone. On the riverfront, Glasgow has a really dysfunctional relationship with its river. It's seen as a source of pride, but there's also a kind of generational trauma from deindustrialisation and a general disconnect. The dominant perception of the river is that it is dead, dirty and dangerous. The reality is that it's a recovering river, and actually it's a lot cleaner and more rich in wildlife than people realise, and encouraging audiences to re-engage with the river excuse me, and its banks is really at the core of the project. Rowing on the Clyde began in the mid-1800s, and Clydesdale Amateur Rowing Club were founded in 1856, swiftly followed by Clyde in 1865. At one time, rowing was a huge sport in Glasgow, with crowds of up to 30,000 people gathering to watch regattas in the interwar period. There are currently 6 clubs based on the river, of which Clyde and Clydesdale are by far the oldest. This is a nice wee shot from 1910, just 5 years after it had opened. Now, Clydesdale Amateur Rowing Club had a ladies' team in the late 1930s, although this seems to have fallen into abeyance after the Second World War. However, it took another 40 years for the clubs to admit women as full members. Both clubs now have a 50-50 gender balance. However, within the clubs, there is a recognition that they need to do much more to address the lack of diversity within their demographics. Rowing is still very much a middle-class sport and a very white-dominated sport. So we've been working closely with the clubs to support them in widening audiences and access through the project. Just to give you an idea of what it's like for the women rowers, the top image there shows the changing facilities for the 70 women of Clydesdale Amateur Rowing Club, and this photo really doesn't do it justice. It's a total pigsty and very, very, very cramped. The bottom image is the gym on the upper floor for Clydesdale. You can see there's a beautiful vintage wooden boat hanging from the wall there, lots of photos and things. So that's all part of our decant process. Some of the issues we have, very, very leaky roof. This is on the other side of the building. This is the Clyde gym with a massive bucket of rainwater. Oh, yeah, this was taken a couple of weeks ago. Just to give you a little bit of context, this is an aerial shot of central and east Glasgow, just showing the location of the West Boathouse on Glasgow Green there. The oldest public park in Europe and the historic birthplace of sport in the city. The yellow line shows the rowing reach, so that's the 6-kilometre stretch of the river that the rowers regularly use. And it's this route that defines the geographic reach of the project itself. On the north bank of the river, you've got the NC95 National Cycle Route. And just to highlight some of the communities that we've been working with, Gorbals here, Calton, Bridgeton, Dalmarnock, and to a lesser extent Parkhead here, just to again give you a little reference point. You've got Celtic Park here, Celtic Football Club, you might have heard of them, and the Emirates Arena and Velodrome. Now, parts of the East End of Glasgow are some of the most socially, economically and culturally deprived communities in Europe, and the figures are really pretty stark. Parkhead and Dalmarnock, 46% of children live in poverty. In Calton and Bridgeton, male life expectancy is 67 and female life expectancy is around 76, so that's a good 15 and 10 years short, respectively, of the national average. However, these metrics are really blunt instruments, and they don't measure or cannot measure the potential of communities or the lived experience. There's a huge appetite for heritage within these communities. It's just that the stories are so rarely told or heard. Another dimension to this is the impact of the 2014 Commonwealth Games. So the Emirates Arena and Velodrome here were built for that, along with the Athletes Village, which occupies this space in here. Like most mega sporting events, there was mass clearance of surrounding communities to make way for venues and parking. A lot of landowners and developers made a killing, and the much touted legacies of jobs never materialised. However, it's not all bad. There were a lot of major infrastructure works, sort of improving connectivity between both sides of the river and this new park in here at the Canningar Loop. So there are lots of sensitivities around sport and sporting heritage in the area that we're working. So just a wee overview of what we've been up to over the past year, or really up to March, pre-COVID. So a lot of time spent developing networking partnerships and just friendships, really. So Glasgow Disability Alliance, Thriving Places, which is part of a locality planning initiative to kind of tackle inequalities. We've also worked closely with Glasgow museums and a range of higher and further education institutions, so Glasgow School of Art, City of Glasgow College, 5 local primary schools, Baltic Street Adventure Playground, the Clyde River Foundation and the Conservation Volunteers. We are doing a fair bit of research, although that's likely to get underway more in this next phase, and I'll explain a little bit why later on. In the same sense, the collections management care is kind of on hold until we decant all the material from the boathouse. But we've had a lot of events and activities that have been maybe more outward facing and a lot of work in the east end of the city and with those kind of communities of the river. So I'm just going to highlight a few of those elements. So as I was saying, the collections care element is really just about to get underway. And a lot of the kind of sports heritage story gathering and research will be taking place over the winter once we've done the decant and got all the material out. And at this point, we'll really be looking to engage with the Rowan community in earnest. Okay, I wanted to pick this element out in particular because it's been one of the most rewarding project components so far. This was a boat building project with Glasgow Disability Alliance. So not everybody is willing or able to get in boats that are like 30 centimetres wide. And we wanted to have a couple of more accessible boats to give people the experience of being out on the river. So we worked with 8 participants from GDA and Archipelago Folk School, who are a group who work to connect people with craft and traditional skills like boat building. And we made 2 of these little caravel skiffs. The idea was that they could critique the process of boat building and also the boats themselves to look at potential modifications and adaptations to the designs that would make them more accessible. Here's some photos from our boat building. And then we had a wee kind of soft launch in November last year on a really beautiful sunny day. That bottom quote there was from one of the young women who was involved in the project. She'd really quite crippling social anxiety, and watching her self-confidence grow over that building period was really amazing, and I think just really illustrated how it's the process that's important and often more important than the product itself. Another element that's been really useful in opening up new audiences is blending that kind of cultural and natural heritage. So we've been working with the conservation volunteers on doing a lot of habitat and species monitoring along the river. We've also been doing quite regular litter picks, some as part of Keep Scotland Beautiful's Upstream Battle Marine Pollution Awareness Drive. And we've also set up the green team with the Clydesdale Club's juniors section. So they are currently developing a green strategy for the clubs and for the building. Interesting for an aquatic sport, rowers are surprisingly blasé about the sort of quality of the water that they're rowing through, even though it makes them quite ill often. And we're hoping that this will raise awareness of issues along the river and also maybe nudge the rowing community to take a more active role in advocating for its care and conservation. Obviously, digital heritage is big on everybody's agenda at the moment and is a great way to open up new audiences. We worked with Glasgow School of Arts, School of Simulation and Visualisation on this project. This was to create an interactive 360-degree journey up the Clyde, and it was really aimed at audiences who can't access the water, either they live remotely or they can't physically access boats, to have an experience of being out on the river. But it's quite unusual. It's using a kind of blended reality approach, so we were dropping in historic images and sound actually within the 360-degree video footage. So that's been kind of to proof of concept stage. And we've also had quite a lot of artists and filmmakers and musicians involved in the project. We also have an artist in residence, Mitch Miller, who's documenting the project, and the people involved, and also helping out with the kind of storytelling side of things. So just to kind of wrap up, a few reflections on that first year, and yeah, some observations. I think we're under quite a lot of pressure to kind of think big, and actually what can be really powerful are those little small scale interventions and activities. They have a kind of compound interest, you know, just little taster sessions, walks with small groups, even just chatting to passers-by, you know, people dropping past the building. It raises awareness, but it also builds trust. And as much as possible, I try to under-promise and over-deliver. That's the goal, really. Particularly, I think this is really important in communities that are maybe less robust. You need to be really sensitive to expectations and make good on your promises, or you really do risk eroding that trust. And taking the time to build relationships is also really important. You should never feel kind of guilty about that. There's again pressure, or you might feel pressure from funders that you must be delivering activity constantly, and actually that networking is so important. That responsive element, I think, has been thrown into very sharp focus with COVID, and we're going to have to overhaul the programme to an extent, but I think what we're hearing from partners in the East End is that awareness and access to green space is really important, and that's something that maybe sports clubs don't realise or maybe overlook. Is that they have a natural heritage asset there as well, and that's a really useful way of kind of bringing in and encouraging new audiences. The other thing I think is yeah, just not to be afraid to experiment, and that evaluation element. It might feel like it's a bit of a milestone around your neck, but increasingly I think funders are recognising the value of that kind of qualitative assessments as much as, you know, the kind of numbers game that seemed to dominate the kind of community heritage sector for a couple of years, where everybody was, you know, obsessed with having engagement with hundreds of people and how many likes they got on Facebook and stuff. That can measure, you know, it can measure interest, but it can never measure impact. So I think you can do a lot on a small budget, but it's really it's kind of having the time is really the kind of critical factor. So those have been some of the things that have worked well. The areas that I really need to work on is actually engaging with the rowing clubs, and I'm hoping that will increase as we get into their own collections, and yeah, getting them interested in their own heritage. For a lot of people, I think, who are really into a sport that requires so much commitment, maybe don't have a lot of headspace to think about the heritage. But I'm hoping that over the winter time, when they're not out on the river, we can kind of take advantage of that. So that's just a few thoughts on the West Boathouse. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I can't help but think that your key phrase was the one about under promising and over delivering. I can imagine that is pretty high in your agenda. Just before we move on, there's a question here about the virtual row. Is that possible to view that somewhere, or could you make that available? Rosie Milne asking for that.
So there's an earlier version, a sort of test run that we've got on the website at the moment. The problem we have is it's kind of to proof of concept stage, and I really want to be able to release the raw files so people can download them and test them out. If they have VR headsets, there'll also be a desktop version. The files are in Glasgow School of Art at the moment, and we can't access them. So until some of those restrictions are lifted and we can get the work finished off, it's kind of on hold. But yeah, I would love to get that out, because what they did was really interesting. So if you've ever worn the headsets before, for a 360-degree video experience, you can look wherever you want. But actually, it's quite interesting when you start to then direct people's attention. So there was sort of audio cues that would tell you that there was content coming up. So you might hear banging noises in your right headset, which tends to direct your gaze towards the right, and you pass an archive image of an old boatyard, or there's the bandstand, all these kind of things. It was actually technically really hard to do, but worth it, and a good opportunity to experiment.
It's maybe something we could pick up, which would be of interest to other people, where there are things like the Commonwealth Games and so on parachuted into cities. I know that particular site you're in, the whole east end of Glasgow, there was, as you said before, the employment figures or the job opportunities never appeared. They have massive infrastructure in terms of the Emirates, Parkhead, and all these glitzy big things. But you possibly have an advantage in that you're closer to the community with the river and so on. Can I just ask, we'll come back to that, pick it up if you will, but just for the three of you, very different projects. If I was to ask you just very quickly, for the three, in your own individual circumstances, the three key things, the top three things, if somebody's in similar circumstances, location or background or anything, what are the top or the first three things that people should be addressing that have worked for you? Tim first.
Okay. We'd never have even got off the ground, except we've spent a lot of time and effort over the last few years building our personal networks with people, so that we're now at the stage where we're hearing from organisations like, for example, Suffolk Archives, and actually yesterday Ipswich Museum reached out to us, asking us if we'd be able to help them with a number of things. And we wouldn't have thought of or maybe had the confidence to reach out to these organisations, but we're actually getting recommended by others and trying to prove ourselves through experience. Certainly the biggest single impact. The second is always remembering that it's not about us, and it's not even just about the football club. It's about the individuals who I guess you would call the consumers of the sporting heritage, but they're not consumers, they're not customers. Football fans hate being called customers. They're not. To a football fan, they are a part of the club, and the club is a part of them. And when it comes to heritage, their story is just as important as the story of the person who kicked the ball into the net that actually created the opportunity for us to ask them. That's only two things. So what's the third one? Don't let a lack of budget get in the way. There's always a way of dealing with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a fairly good message, actually, in these trying times where people have to look at things in that way. Tim, what would you offer?
You mean Keith?
Oh, so sorry, Keith. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong page a minute.
Probably one important thing I found was to identify the community leaders and get them on your side, because generally if you do that, then they'll bring people with them. Another thing would be experiment, and you don't have to go full throttle and do the big thing first. You can do a trial run, do a prototype, just a smaller version of what you want to do, and see if it works, and learn from that. And then when you do put the investment and the money into the big thing, it's better placed. And thirdly, you just listen to the people you're working with. you're flogging a dead horse if you're trying to do something that they're not connecting with. And if they want to try something different, there's nothing wrong with trying it. And if it fails, just saying, let's go back and rethink this. It's all about learning for both you and for the people you're working with.
Yeah, you're on the same path there in terms of the under promising is probably a better tactic.
Yeah.
I think that you would all agree with that. Is that fair? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Rather than be over ambitious, particularly in the early stages. Don't fail in the early bits. Yeah.
Yeah, I think building that community trust is really, really critical. And so much of community heritage is managing people's expectations. And yeah, I think listening, as Keith said, is the critical thing. Sometimes you just have to let people get it out there, and then you can move forward.
Yeah.
I think you're probably in a very novel situation compared to the others here today. That you're. I mean, if I look out the window, it started raining. I mean, that kind of thing must bring panic to you. I mean, you've got so many different plates you're spinning, plus you're having to keep that building standing, so you can do something with it.
Yes, and I think as part of my,
remind you of that.
I know. Well, part of the kind of midpoint evaluation has been like, oh my God, this has turned into a bit of a sprawling beast. And I think with COVID, it's an opportunity to kind of take stock and simplify. Now, I think that's kind of the critical thing. Is to kind of, it's always going back to those kind of core messages and goals for the project. And yeah, I did worry a little bit about this session that I didn't have enough of the kind of sporting heritage stuff in there, but I think it will come through, and actually laying that groundwork with the communities has been more important.
So can I ask all three of you, Keith, maybe you pick this up first. How do you evaluate the success or whatever of your project? I mean, I think you hinted at you do it as you go along, which is fine. I suppose if you have external funders, they will impose an evaluation scheme of some kind on you. But what are you, I mean, when you wake up every morning, I mean, how do you evaluate what you've done in the time before? Do you have time to do that?
No, very rarely. There's a set way to do it, obviously, for your funders, but again, it's building that relationship with the people you're working with. You'll know very, very quickly if you're on the right track. Getting them to actually, vocalize that's difficult at times. I think as well, I don't think I'm wrong in saying some funders are now realizing that every time somebody does a project, they get this report back saying everything's wonderful. Yeah. And it's not really the truth. I mean, we have to start telling funders, like, we tried this, it didn't work. If anybody else tries it, here's what you do to make it work. But it's just having, people think if they say that, they'll not get any more money. And that culture has to change.
Do you ever, any of you, and maybe Tim, do you ever have to tell the people who are trying to evaluate you incessantly that, hey, give us a break, we're too busy doing the project?
We really try not to, and I think that's probably a lesson we both learned from our professional careers going back a few years. But it's really important for us to understand, given that most of our work is with partner organisations, for us to understand what their motivations are and what they're looking for from it. So it's not simply what can we do and how do we put ourselves across, but how can we use our contribution to it to help them to enhance their offering. And that's where we get the best feedback, probably. For example, our work with New Wolsey Theatre a couple of years ago, they actually enabled us to decorate up all the common areas of the theatre with ITFC heritage memorabilia, with telling the story of the club as well as the cup run and so on. You can only achieve that if you have trust from an organisation. And in the end, I think the proof of that partnership, I'm afraid, did come down to numbers. Was the theatre full? Well, actually, the last 2 weeks of the run, I don't think there was hardly a spare seat. And in the end, I think it has to be judged probably in that way, where it's that kind of partnership.
And in your particular circumstance, is there any point where, I'm not inviting you to be critical in any sense here, but is there any point at which the corporate entity of the football club, you said you're separate, do they ever kind of suggest you should be coming in under us and we want to maximize and upscale? And is that a reality, or could that happen?
That's a great question. Whilst it is a huge disadvantage for us to be operating independently and with no budget, the way the football club operates, they will give us any support that they can, but it kind of stops at the point where it costs them hard cash.
Yeah.
And I understand that. It's a loss-making club. The owner puts a huge amount of money in just to get the team on the park. We're very lucky that our relationships are such that we can benefit in all kinds of, if you like, soft ways from their resources. But no one has yet tried to take over what we do. One day in the future, I'm going to really hope that somebody does. But for the moment, the relationships seem to be working in such a way that it hasn't been an issue for us.
So just to finish off in the last few minutes then, Keith, I mean, you had a kind of fixed, you were dealing with a fixed point in terms of the centenary, I suppose, and you know, we all, once these centenaries happen and they're maybe captured, maybe not, you know, what is there a development aspect to that particular story that you would see other characters or famous people being developed in a similar way?
Possibly not in the sense that you're thinking there. I mean, the way we developed that was using sport to actually access into communities that we weren't reaching as much as we should. And so from that developed into a Gaelic sports project where we went to 3 or 4 of the rural towns and villages where people had never been to the museum. So we worked with them on sporting projects. And then the motorcycle road racing, of course, opened up a massive audience to us. So in one respect, the development on that project was just using sport as a way to bring in a broader audience.
So it was pretty much a pilot in a way, although it was very specific. Yeah, you could learn from it. Yeah. So where do you go from here, Ingrid? What's tomorrow's job? Apart from
tomorrow's job, a risk assessment for the decant of the building.
Right.
So hopefully we should be getting kicked off with that. But yeah, I've just had to cancel a load of other workshops and sessions and stuff. Because of COVID, it's just constantly changing, and yeah, it's frustrating. But
just in a word, all three of you, I mean, I've mentioned before, there are opportunities appearing through COVID. And you know, if you were to balance it, do you think COVID is really damaging, or can you see a way through it? Are you kind of optimistic that things can be changed and repurposed to manage your way through the challenges in the local environment?
It's really hard at the moment. I mean, we're at an advantage in that a lot of the program was outdoor activity. So I thought, well, actually, we just modify and adapt, and that can potentially carry on. But at the moment, it's really not been possible to do that. There's pretty much a blanket ban.
Keith?
Well, the project I'm working on at the minute is in Coal Island, and it's industrial heritage. Yeah. But the funding's there. Lottery have promises, so it's just making sure that money's spent, because we can do things, and the organisations we're working with need that money. So I mean, there is a certain amount of weight on my shoulders to make sure that we do something and they get the money, because they really need it. Really, you know, the theatres and the clubs and community groups. Otherwise, you know, where will they be in a year's time? So, yeah, I mean, it's doable, and we just got to think outside the box. Really.
And I think that's a message all funders need to understand and need to be persuaded that they need to be flexible, if at all possible, because of that. So the final word, Tim?
We've had to repurpose what we do. We've had to stop doing a lot of activities that were proving very successful. And what we're having to teach ourselves is that we can benefit from the time we're saving and invest that in the projects that I've explained today. It's not where we have chosen to be, but we're happy to be here. I'd like to be in a different place in a year's time.
Well, I hope you're in Stirling in a year's time.
Absolutely.
that would be the answer to all our problems. Thank you very much to Keith, to Tim, and to Ingrid. That's just about got us to 3 o'clock, and we've now got a 15-minute break, and we'll be back starting at 3:15 with a different panel. And for 45 minutes or thereabouts, we'll bring the show to a close. Once again, thanks to all three of you for your contributions, and we'll see you in about 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.